I wanted to start by doing something that I often forget to do, which is talk about myself, because I think that what brings each of us here is really a story that connects all of us together, and I think it tends to inspire other people into action. And I think to that extent, it's very useful to bring in our personal stories into why we are doing what we're doing, why we are engaged in a political struggle, or why we should be engaged in a political struggle. And so I'm an economics teacher at Seattle Central Community College, which is a very odd profession for a Marxist to be an economist in today's world. So, and as you might guess, I have to swim against the stream. But the most interesting thing that is happening since 2 years ago is that the tide is starting to turn. And I think, and I hope that out of this discussion, I mean, I know you will have a lot of questions and we will not be able to resolve all questions today. And I wanted to actually start by inviting you all in advance to come and continue the conversation with us. But I hope that one of the things that we all go out with, tonight, would be the realization that the tide is turning. And in fact, we have amazing people like Rich Lang, who, in the middle of the United States, is inviting an immigrant woman to talk about socialism in Seattle. I mean, I hope you all realize what an incredible thing this is. And hopefully we will all feel empowered by that. So just to give a little bit of background of how we came this far, when I say we, I mean Socialist Alternative. I'm a member of Socialist Alternative. It's a nationwide organization of socialists and activists. And as you might guess, we have been since about 1985 very active in fighting various battles for social and economic justice. But we don't just fight on single issues. Our approach as socialists, as Marxists, is that a lot of the problems that we see and a lot of the problems that progressives and young people and women feel a lot of anger, justifiable anger and outrage about, are not isolated issues. I mean, if you're angry about the attacks on the reproductive rights of women, if you're angry about the almost skyrocketing of rape cases and just gruesomeness of sexual violence, if you're angry about the attacks on LGBT rights, if you're angry about how hard it's been to fight for LGBT rights, if you're thinking about the homelessness and the poverty, if you're thinking about why the big banks got away free and the rest of us had to shoulder the burden of the crisis in the form of unemployment and budget cuts, all these questions are so interrelated because they're stemming from a system that endlessly and relentlessly creates conditions for all these problems. And of course, the system is capitalism. And I often like to say that in some ways, it's more radical to talk about, to name the problem, name the problem as capitalism than even to talk about socialism as the alternative. Of course, as socialists, we are advocating for socialism as the alternative, and that I hope to make headway in convincing everybody about that. However, there's lots of people in the labor movement, the president of my union, several well-meaning people who will say, well, socialism, yes, that's a great idea in theory. And maybe someday in the distance, maybe 100 years from now, maybe the human race will be ready for socialism. I mean, it's a very depressing and misanthropic idea of human nature that, oh, socialism can't actually work, and maybe we will evolve into a nicer, kinder race in several hundred years, and then it will be viable. And a lot of people have that attitude towards socialism, and that, let me tell you, my brothers and sisters, is a real barrier to actually building viable movements. Because if you don't believe that a change is possible and that there is an alternative, then you're not going to fight for it. And so that is why I feel like in some ways it is far more radical to first recognize what the problem is and that the problem is capitalism. Name the problem, because only when you're willing to name the problem will you say, okay, if I'm convinced that the root of all these problems is capitalism, then obviously we need to look for an alternative. So what is that alternative? And then the conversation about, well, you know, we need socialism, and I know socialism means different things to different people, but we can talk about that. And so in Socialist Alternative, you know, our nationwide organization, while we fight alongside people on single issues, against the war, against the coal trains and so on, we're always bringing the message that if we really want to be effective in fighting against climate change, in fighting against social and economic justice, we have to recognize that as long as this system exists, as long as capitalism exists, these problems will not only recur, they'll keep occurring, but they're also going to be more and more magnified. So, I mean, and I hardly need to convince you on that. I mean, look at what's happened to poverty in the United States. This is the wealthiest country in the history of humanity, and what we are seeing is an enormous increase in poverty. I mean, a 5-year-old child will tell you that it should be going the other way. Wait a minute, if wealth is going up in society, shouldn't poverty be going down in society? How is it that wealth is going up and poverty is also going up? And you know, that's one of the basic things we need to understand, that the concentration of enormous wealth in the hands of the few is not unrelated to the enormous increase in poverty. It's actually, there's a causal link. It's precisely because all this wealth is flowing to the top that there is less and less left at the bottom. So it shouldn't be any surprise to us that the wealth in society is going up and the poverty is also rising. And so we believe as socialists that it is extremely important to get that message out in movements, and ultimately that if the working class, the class of people, the 99%, however you want to refer to it, the group of people all around the world, you know, the billions of people who are working so hard and getting so little to show for it, if we are to make any changes, any improvements in our standard of living, we have a twofold task on our hands, not only to fight against the specific attacks on our standards of living, but also to fight for a better system itself, because unless we change the system, these things will be going on. And I actually mentioned the attacks on reproductive rights specifically because it's a very good example. You know, I've met a lot of young people, you know, both men and women, who've said that, wait a minute, didn't we already fight for this in the 60s and 70s? How is it that we're fighting for it today? The only way we'll be able to explain why we are going to have to fight the battles again and again is if we recognize that these attacks are not just coming from a few right-wing nuts who don't have their screw straight, but it's because the system itself creates the conditions where you have these arguments made, and you have entire state governments, state legislators, fighting to wipe out the rights that women had fought for 40 years ago. And I mean, as Socialist Alternative, we are also affiliated with an international organization that is called a Committee for a Workers International. And it's very interesting that our topic today is relevance of socialism in Seattle, because it's actually quite hard to think about socialism existing in just one place. But I think it would be interesting for us to draw out the conditions in Seattle and why we should argue for ending capitalism and putting in place a socialist economy in Seattle. But while we say that, we should also be fully aware that if it doesn't matter how you look at it. If you look at it as a moral economy, if you look at a socially and economically just economy, if you look at it as a fair economy, whatever you want to call it, what I mean by socialism, the only viable way for that to survive would be for not only for Seattle to turn socialist, Spokane would need to turn socialist, Bellingham would need to be socialist, and Cairo would need to be socialist, Bombay would need to be socialist. In other words, in reality, what we are talking about is the need for an internationalist orientation, a global orientation, and that's what I would call globalization. I mean, I reject the capitalist agenda of globalization that they have put forth, using the IMF and the World Bank. But there's truly something global about this. And the fact is that capitalism itself is a global system, and we have to have movements everywhere challenging the system, and ultimately we have the task of transforming the global economy into a socialist economy. But we have to start somewhere. So we have to sow these seeds everywhere. So everywhere where we're having these conversations, it's absolutely critical. It's absolutely important for us to see what is the connection of the problems that we're seeing in Seattle to capitalism. Why are they the product of capitalism? I mean, it might be tempting to think that the problems in Seattle don't have much to do with the global problems, because, let's face it, Seattle is not as bad as Bangladesh, right? It's not as bad as Dhaka. We don't have that kind of massive poverty. We are talking about minor things. However, that's not true. In fact, the problems that we are looking at in Seattle and statewide are actually only growing in numbers. They're growing in size. And it's exactly like reproductive rights. We are going to have to fight bigger battles to actually challenge the corporate agenda in politics. And so how do we do that is the question. And because we believe that this movement has to be international in nature, we are actually affiliated with this international organization, and we have our fellow activists fighting the same battle, and having these same conversations in over 40 different countries in the world, including countries like Nigeria, my home country, India, Sweden, and several other countries in Europe, and Pakistan. So I hope that that will also be very exciting for us, because I think it's important in many ways to keep that in mind. Not only because if we are convinced that socialism cannot work just in Seattle, then it's important for us to encourage an international movement, but also because it's very empowering. I mean, it's very empowering for us to realize that we're not fighting a narrow parochial citywide battle here, and to realize that everything that we do here to make things better is actually going to be a beacon of hope for people everywhere else. And so I think that should be the basis of our conversation. And in terms of why many of us, why have members of Socialist Alternative become socialist? Why have they become members of Socialist Alternative? Why are we running this campaign? Why did we run this campaign last year? I think it's very important to point out that unlike, and this is something that you will see only with grassroots campaigns and most often with socialists, unlike the Democrats and Republicans, our election campaigns are not driven by the need of any one person to establish a stellar political career where they're fattening their pockets. We are a democratic organization, and for us, the candidate is in some ways incidental, because the more important question is, does it make sense for Socialist Alternative to carry out an election campaign? What example would that set to the left? That is the question that drives us. And so hopefully, I'm sure many of you know that we ran a campaign, electoral campaign last year. Rich mentioned Frank Chop, our opponent, our esteemed opponent, the Speaker of the House, the most powerful legislator of the state. And I think it's very important to point out, it's very relevant to our discussion today, that even though we had a small fraction of the money he had, even though he has such a long political record in Olympia, he has cronies everywhere, even though we had a very relatively small volunteer base, we were able to poster the entire 43rd district in such a way that even today when we walk on the streets, even today when we're on Broadway, we still have people stopping us and saying, hey, your posters, yeah, that actually helped me to know about your campaign, and we voted for you. And we got 20,000 votes. That's over 29% of the vote. And I think we should all be asking this question: how did that happen? How is it that such a tiny campaign with a small group of people who are activists, we are not electioneers, we're not professional election consultants, how did we manage to do that? And really, the secret to that is the fact that the tide is turning. since Occupy, since the Egyptian Revolution, since the uprising of public sector workers in Wisconsin, despite all the failures of all these movements, what they have done is opened the floodgates of genuine discussion, genuine political discussions. And let me tell you, once the working class loses its fear of actually talking about the truth, talking about reality and challenging the system, all is lost for the capitalist class. Seriously, the only thing that is holding us back is our fear and maybe our lack of understanding of how we can solve these problems. And I wanted to frame that in, within some numbers. Sorry, I'm an economist, I can't help it. But I promise you, I actually don't have too many numbers today, so you're safe. But just to highlight the abject failure of this system, let's start with the city of Seattle. Seattle, I'm sure you will agree with me, is an incredibly wealthy city, in an incredibly wealthy state, in an incredibly wealthy country. Are we agreed on that? We have people like Bill Gates living here. Does anybody know how much the wealth of Bill Gates is? How much he owns? Over 50 billion, yeah, $56 billion. 72 billion? That's nice for him. You know, that is equivalent to about the GDP, the total income of about 23 countries put together. That should be, I mean, if we're all on the right track here, that should be staggering for us. I mean, that should be like, oh my God, that makes no sense at all. But yes, he is one of the wealthiest people in the world, but then you have Paul Allen. I don't know how much his wealth is, but it's probably in a similar ballpark. And then you have several other multi-billionaires. And in fact, Seattle has, it's a dubious distinction. It has the 10th largest concentration of what are called ultra-high net worth households, those with at least $30 million of wealth. And I want to remind everybody that this is not income we are talking about. We're talking about wealth, meaning all the stuff that they've put aside in the form of stock holdings, gold, real estate, all the things that they're not using for their day-to-day expenses. And that's very striking, because therein lies your answer. If all the wealth, that is, if you count up the total wealth of the city of Seattle, it's, several $100 billion. If the vast majority of that wealth is in the hands of a few individuals, then what is going to be left over to make sure that the city's public transit is functional, to make sure that the elderly and the disabled have all the necessary services, to make sure that jobs are created for everybody, especially in this economic crisis, to make sure that child care services, education, healthcare, basic health, to make sure that all these services are funded. There is no money for this. And in fact, it's very striking to see that while we have such unimaginable wealth in this city, at the same time, the city is facing a $56 million budget shortfall. Our first step should be to just reject this scenario. I mean, how is it even possible that there is so much wealth in the city and we're struggling for change? I mean, $1 million is change when you're talking about people who are multi-billionaires. Why is it that we are not able to fund our city even with this small change in order to make these basic things possible? I want to give you another example, just to put those numbers into context. While we have multi-billionaires, while our city is facing a $56 million budget shortfall, that shortfall is outside of the $937 million the city council pledged for building the tunnel. Many of you are familiar with the issues related to the tunnel. And in fact, the inevitable increases in the cost of the tunnel will easily add up to over $1 billion. And so you might ask, so what does this have to do with capitalism? Who is making the decisions? Who is deciding that while Seattle is struggling for, most people in Seattle are struggling for basic needs, that almost $1 billion or over $1 billion would be given to a project that only the Downtown Business Association wants. Everybody else in the city, anybody who has any sort of environmental consciousness, and this is a very environmentally conscious city, is opposed to any project that actually does not develop public transit as a real alternative. So this question is not just economics, and I would like us to to think about it as not an economic question, but as a political question. Because if you look at the amount of money that is needed for solving many of the problems that plague our city, we have many times over. We have the money many times over. But we, as in you and I, we don't have control over that enormous wealth. And that is why that leaves us completely incapable of solving those problems. And what you see in the city establishment, in the form of the mayor, the city council, and everybody else who's involved in various different government offices, anybody who has any sort of decision-making power, what are they going to do? What have they been doing? If you look at the whole history, history of the last 20, 30 years of policy making in Seattle, it's not an accident that most of the things that have been done by the city council have been in favor of big business, in favor of the Downtown Business Association. I'll give you one example. I mean, I don't want to talk about our campaign this year, but the city council, when environmental activists were insisting that there should be very serious environmental impact assessments about the tunnel, the city council said, oh, no, we don't need that, let's go, just go ahead, that's not a problem. And when the people in the city were trying to build sort of an annex homeless shelter, I can't remember exactly where, but the city council put up a wall immediately and said that, oh, we need enormous numbers of environmental impact assessments for a homeless shelter. I mean, look at how these priorities are skewed. And a lot of people that we talk to agree with us. They say that, yes, the priorities are skewed. But the real question is, why is it that the priorities are skewed? Do the city council members not have high school degrees and college degrees? Do they not understand what we're talking about? They have a perfectly good understanding of the issues. They understand what's happening. They understand what will be needed to combat climate change. They understand that ultimately the only way you can combat homelessness and poverty in Seattle is by actually putting money, putting resources into solving those problems, into creating jobs, and so on. I wanted to, give you an anecdote just to illustrate what I mean by this. I mean, often people say that, well, I sympathize with what you're saying, but it's not really a question of money. We just have we have a budget shortfall. What can you do? It's not really something that you can throw money at it, and so on. This is a very interesting story, nothing to do with Seattle per se, but there's a very sort of very determined activist for public education called Jonathan Kozol. He's probably in his 80s now, so he's spent 5 decades fighting for public education. But incidentally, he himself is sort of blue-blooded. He graduated from Harvard, so he has friends in high places. And one time, he was talking to a Congress member, in Washington D.C., who was his friend. And he was, as usual, ferociously advocating for funding for public education and pointing out that the public education system is actually more segregated today than it was before the civil rights era, which is something for us to think about. And this Congress member, this millionaire, big shot, he asked Jonathan, well, John, do you really think that this is a problem that can be solved by throwing money at it? And John says, why not? It worked for your kids. And I think that really captures the essence of what we are bringing as a message, which is that, yes, these problems are born out of the fact that the enormous amounts of wealth are concentrated in the hands of the few who have no interest in fighting for our standards of living. And the only real way ultimately to fight that agenda and to actually make sure that decent standards of living are delivered to the people of Seattle is for us to take democratic control over the resources of the economy. And we, as a way to begin that battle, to equalize the economy, we have put forward the point that the millionaires and the billionaires need to be taxed, corporations need to be taxed. Does anybody know how much Microsoft pays to the legislature in taxes on its profits?
They've moved their taxes to Nevada, although they're in Redmond, Washington for some reason. And the people in Washington say, oh, no problem with this.
So what's the number? 0. One of the most profitable multinational corporations in the world is based right here, and they pay 0 in taxes to the state treasury. And how much are we paying? If you look at the amount of taxes that effectively, I mean, we don't have a tax on high incomes or wealth, but we have a tax on consumption, And if you see effectively, the poorest people, the people who are making less than $40,000, they're paying nearly 18% of their income in taxes. So one of the points we are bringing up, obviously, is the fact that the first thing we need to do in order to solve these problems is to tax the millionaires, tax the billionaires, tax corporations. What is the first thing that people often say to us in response? People say, yes, that's a great idea, but isn't Boeing going to leave if you tax it? Isn't Microsoft going to leave if you tax it? And I want to point out that Boeing is paying historically low taxes, and they're moving those jobs anyway. We are not going to be able to hold on to those jobs on the basis of the logic of capitalism. If we accept their logic that we have to make this city and this state more and more unlivable and unaffordable for ordinary working people because we need to create a more and more favorable climate for these extremely profitable corporations so that they keep their jobs in this state, then it's a failed start to begin with, because what's going to happen? Every state, and this is where I think the battle in Seattle connects to everything that everybody else does in every other state, and why we need a movement towards socialism everywhere, which is that every state is competing. The state officials and the city officials of every city are competing with each other, not to provide a better standard of living for their own people, but to provide a more and more favorable tax climate for corporations. So it doesn't matter how much we do it, we will never be able to compete with poor states like South Carolina. The jobs are always going to move there. And forget South Carolina, are we going to be able to compete with Philippines, where the jobs are now moving, or Bangladesh? So really you can see how the issues in Seattle are linked to the nationwide issues and international issues. And ultimately, the answer to this problem that Boeing takes its jobs elsewhere is socialism. And what I mean by that is actually taking over the biggest corporations into democratic public ownership, meaning the Boeing executives don't own it, we own it together. Boeing workers own it, have an equal share in it, and the community has an equal share in it. And we decide what to do with those jobs. We decide what to produce. We decide how much to produce. And if we were, I mean, I'm not suggesting that we are in a position to do that right now. I think this is a message we have to carry out to more and more people. But if we did do that, then, when the CEOs say, well, we have to move to South Carolina, we can tell the CEOs, well, you can move if you want, but the jobs stay here. The machinery is here. The people who have built Boeing planes are here. The people who built Boeing planes are not the CEOs. That's another source of confusion often. It's not the CEOs who are coming up with cures for cancer. The CEOs of pharmaceutical companies are not the people who are coming up with cures for cancer. It is the scientists who are working at the National Institutes of Health who may be making, a $70,000 or $100,000 salary, but they're not the capitalists. They're not multi-billionaires. And they're doing it because they love their job. They love research. That's why they're doing it. And if you look at every such technological innovation, whether it's aeronautics or medicine, it's actually done by the working class, by ordinary people. So why should we, when we are fully capable of running things, when we are already producing all the wealth in society, why should the CEOs own it on paper? Why should they take 99% of what is the wealth that is produced? We should be owning it, and we should be able to run it. And think about this. If when we talk about socialism, what do we mean? I just wanted to clarify. We're talking about our idea of socialism is what we call democratic socialism, meaning that all these major resources that are necessary for production, the production units, the factories, and so on, are democratically owned by people in society, not by a few people. This also means several different things. I mean, it opens up a whole world of conducting society in a radically different manner. Think about if Boeing was to be democratically owned by ordinary people, what would Boeing end up producing? See, right now, Boeing can focus a lot of its resources in building warplanes, building destructive machinery. But if ordinary people are going to own it, they don't want their children to die in wars. They don't want the people that they know to die in wars. And I have not met a single ordinary person, like a working class person who says, oh, I'm glad the drones fell on Pakistanis. Every person I have met is just anguished by that. Every person I have met here, regardless of their skin color, is absolutely anguished by what the government is doing in Iraq, has done in Iraq and Afghanistan. But the reason it's happening is because the people who call for wars are not the ones fighting the wars. We are the ones fighting the wars. Our children are the ones fighting the wars. The children of the poor are the ones who are sent to the battlefield because they have no other way of making some semblance of a future for themselves. And so if we had the choice, if we had the decision-making power in our hands, there is no way. I mean, I defy anyone to convince me that people will vote for war when their own children are going to be fighting the wars. Nobody is going to fight for wars nobody wants to go and fight wars. They are doing it because they don't have a choice. And that's the problem with capitalism. We're talking about an alternate economy, a socialist economy, where we actually have a choice. And the reason a lot of this discussion is focused on economics and economic ownership of resources is because today we do have a right on paper. We have the right to vote. We have certain rights on paper, but the rights are not backed up by actual power to actually bring about change. When was the last time the Democratic Party invited you to say, hey, I want you to come and give me your opinion about whether we should have socialized medicine? The vast majority of people we know are for some form of socialized medicine, and yet it never gets done. This is the 21st century in the world, and yet we have 50,000 Americans dying every year simply because of lack of health care. This is a completely ludicrous situation. But why is it happening? Is it because they don't understand the importance of healthcare? Should we sit down with, Frank Chop and Obama and all these guys and, try to convince them intellectually that we need socialized medicine? No, they know what's happening, but they have no interest in dealing with that problem. And that's symptomatic of the system itself. And we have to ultimately say that it doesn't matter which issue we are talking about. If we really want to bring about this change, then we have to move in a direction that is completely separate from the current system. And if you look at how Canada got its healthcare, that story is very interesting. Hopefully somebody can say more about it. But the reality is that Canada's to whatever extent it's working, the public healthcare system didn't come about because some guys at the top decided that would be a nice thing. Let's be generous today. I'm feeling generous today. Let's give socialized medicine to people. No, it happened because there was a groundswell of movement headed by the labor movement, by socialists, by ordinary people who said, no, we need this. And they put in place not only healthcare, but a whole host of services, which are now all under attack because that's the way the capitalist system works. Every time there's a recession, they will tell you, oh, there's no money for public funding. We're going to take it back. How many times are we going to fight for the same thing? How many years are we going to fight for one single improvement in our economy? And I have to end, and I haven't even talked about the other big problems in our city. Look at how homelessness is skyrocketing. every time you walk on the streets, you see newer and newer young people. You know, when you look at homeless people, you can tell if they've been on the streets for a while or they're just newly homeless. I increasingly see younger and younger people who it's clear that they just became homeless. And when you talk to a few of them, they'll tell you that, yeah, I just got kicked out. I got evicted. My landlord evicted me because I don't have a job and I can't pay my rent. And here I am out on the streets, and I've been on the streets for a few days. This is inhuman. This should be completely unacceptable for us. And the only way we can fight against this is to take things into our own agenda. And hopefully, some of you will also talk about the other problem that is looming on the horizon, and that is the coal trains. You know, the city council passed a resolution opposing the coal trains, but it is a completely toothless resolution that is just meant for the echo chambers of City Hall. How is that actually going to stop these enormous corporations that are absolutely determined, because they are driven purely by profit? That is the agenda of capitalism: profit maximization for the owners of, you know, all the resources. They're not going to stop because the city council passed a resolution. You know who is pushing for the coal trains? It's BNSF, you know, a big corporation. But behind all the coal, behind big coal is the big banks. It's Goldman Sachs. Do you think Goldman Sachs, you know, we all know what an, you know, just an evil vampire squid it is. Do you think they're going to stop because the city council passed a resolution? No. We're going to have to create, you know, we're going to have to build a mass movement that says, no, we are going to stand between Seattle and coal. There is no way there is going to be coal in this city. But how do we do that? We have to really, that movement, if it is to succeed, has to and will, I hope, develop a radical edge where people are, through the battle of fighting against the coal trains, will start to realize that, you know, if I need to work so hard to make this one change happen, there must be something fundamentally wrong about the system. And that is how social movements have worked in history. Every time people, especially young people, and I really appeal to you all to join the movement, when they become part of the movement, they realize what a barrier the system is. And the act of fighting for a change itself is an educator, where people say, okay, I think I have to go ahead, keep going and fight against the system itself. And I see Rich coming here, and I know I've talked for too long. I hope I didn't bore you. But I know that Rich likes to do this really interesting thing where people break out into groups and discuss. And I wanted to throw out two questions that hopefully will guide the discussion, but, you know, feel free to discuss whatever intrigues you most. But one of the questions is, can all the problems that we see in Seattle, can those problems be fixed under capitalism? And the second question is, can we have socialism in Seattle? Is it viable, or is it just too big? We can't make it happen. I'll stop there. So in terms of the terminology, I mean, I call myself a socialist and a Marxist both, and they're not contradictory in the sense that if you ask us, you know, what kind of world are we fighting for, then it's, you know, it's a socialist economy or a socialist society. But a lot of what we do in terms of tactics and strategies and how we try to build movements and lead movements, our analysis of the capitalist system itself, why we are convinced that capitalism, regardless of all the technological innovations and the wealth generated, will never actually work for the working class. All this is rooted in a political science, which we call, you know, Marxist economics or Marxism. So Marxism is the theoretical basis or underpinnings of what we do as socialists. So they basically mean the same thing, except to say that there are a lot of people who consider themselves socialists who very consciously deliberately reject Marxist ideas. So we are not among those people. There are lots of people also who think that, you know, the current state of capitalism is pretty bad, and we do need to do something about homelessness. We need increased funding for education. You know, you'll often meet people who you know, we need to be a Sweden or a Finland. They are what we would call social democrats. they're not socialist in the sense that they're not talking about actually transforming the economy away from capitalism towards a totally different economy. What they're saying is we need a somewhat kinder, gentler form of capitalism as it might have existed in Western Europe. And I would say erstwhile Western Europe, because those programs are not the same anymore. In fact, that is an argument against capitalism and against thinking that capitalism can be reformed, because yes, labor movements of the past did succeed in fighting for reforms and did succeed in giving a better standard of living to most people as compared to the US. So, you know, yes, you did have public health care and education and everything in countries like Sweden, but ultimately what is happening now is that the capitalist class there is using the recession as an excuse to carry out massive attacks to many of these programs. So they're not, it's not like once you have a public program under capitalism, it's going to be etched in stone. No, from the moment of its inception, it is under attack. In fact, the way it comes into being also is a reflection of attacks, because even if we fought for socialized medicine in the US, you know, you will see how hard it will be to make it look like we want it to look. So for example, in England, the National Health Service was set up because the working class, you know, valiantly fought for it, but the form of the health service that got set up did not eliminate private profit. It still allowed private clinics and private hospitals, and that was a very convenient way for the capitalist class to start attacking it from day one. You know, sort of made it, you know, took some of the power of it from under its own feet. And so ultimately, social democrats, while they're well-meaning, have to be won over into the idea of actually setting up a socialist economy. And as far as the word communism is concerned, yes, we are communists too. We don't reject that idea, and I wasn't deliberately not avoiding it. However, the reality is that you know, especially for those of us who grew up in the shadow of the Cold War, and you know, especially in the United States, communism has been equated. The word communism has been equated with what existed in the former Soviet Union, and what existed in the former Soviet Union is what we would call you know, a bureaucratic dictatorship, and it started out as a genuine workers' revolution in 1917, which for various reasons, which if people are interested, we could get into. You know, it's a very interesting and informative story. But for a whole host of reasons, that genuine the beginnings of the socialist economy didn't actually survive and ultimately turned into what came to be known as Stalinism, or what we would call a bureaucratic dictatorship. And we, as Marxists, call that whole period of the Soviet Union as a degenerated worker state, meaning it was to begin with, it had the potential to be a genuine socialist economy that we're talking about, but for a combination of reasons, degenerated into what it, you know, eventually became. And you know, I wanted to point out that you know, there's a whole host of reasons why that happened, but not the least of that is the fact that other countries the working class of other countries weren't able to follow in those footsteps. Socialism cannot survive in one country, you know, because the moment you have, if you had, I mean, hypothetically speaking, if you had a really successful example of a workers' economy, what would happen? The working class everywhere would look at that economy and say, hey, we want that, you know, and that's very dangerous for the ruling class, because as long as there is a successful example and people clamoring for that, they're not going to have that kind of control that they have now over the working class. So it's not in their interest to have any particular small example of that. So that's why ultimately we need to transform the entire global economy. That's an excellent question. Thank you, Rich, for asking that. And I think primarily what we're talking about is a shift in consciousness. That is ultimately the only way we can transform society, because we, you know, think about this, right? There are a few Marxists or socialists in this room where we know what we're talking about, but we're not able to transform society unless millions of people join us. So our job really is carrying out a massive shift in consciousness There's no question about that. That is the real source of power of bringing about a revolutionary change in the way society and the economy is organized. However, I wouldn't agree exactly that it's a Gandhian approach in terms of discipling people. Gandhi did use that approach, and Gandhi had really did have a pretty astute political analysis in many ways, and he was very effective in many of the things he did. However, we have a lot of differences with him and also his approach, in the sense that, one of the things is that we don't necessarily think that sort of proselytizing to people would really bring that change. What we believe is that it's in the interests of the working class to fight for these things. So we don't think that we have to really convince people in that sense, but we have to make them aware of what they already feel. There's a latent anger, there's a latent outrage, there's also a latent understanding of how the system works, but that has to be brought out to the fore. And so consciousness is really at the center. Consciousness and the evolution of consciousness is really at the center of everything we do, because it's a complex process. We can't really say that, well, look at how bad the economy is. Why don't people understand? Why aren't they out on the streets? It doesn't work that way. History has shown that there's a whole. It's an intriguing way in which people actually bring themselves into action, into struggle. But what we do know, and this is what really defines Marxists, is that we do know that the working class not only has the capability to understand what it needs to do, what kind of economy it needs to put in place for its own good, but also that it will be able to develop over time, understand through struggle, it will be able to understand what needs to be done in order to actually get there. There are two parts to this problem, right? One is what should we get to instead of this, but how should we get there? So we really have faith in the working class that it can actually do this, but we don't have faith in them because we want to be optimists. No, our faith in the working class is grounded in the understanding, I'm sure people have heard this quote from Marx where he says that capitalism creates its own gravediggers. We don't create the conditions for the working class to get into struggle. The system does that itself. What we bring is perhaps a more evolved understanding of how we can get there. What are the most effective tactics and strategies? It comes down to day-to-day things like, if you want to carry out an anti-war protest on Broadway, what are the best slogans that will bring people towards you as opposed to alienating them from you? What are the best ways you can talk to people about why there is a need to protest against war, why there's a need to protest against homelessness, how can we actually carry out this election campaign? So we have this approach where we think that all the power, all the tools of fighting this fight are already existing in the working class, but they have to be drawn out in many ways. And in terms of the question of violence, which I think is a very, very key question that has come up, ultimately our best weapon is going to be, politically mobilizing millions and millions and millions of people. If you think about the amount of physical weaponry that the ruling class owns, the military, the police apparatus, look at what the SPD is able to do. Every time you have a protest, they have this, this whole room full of ammunitions and tear gas shells and everything that they're able to unleash on us. We won't be able to compete with it, and nor should we try to, because our power lies not in trying to match weapon for weapon, but mobilizing our real weapon, which is people. There's a few hundred on top, there's billions of us at the bottom. The only thing that is stopping us from changing this is a sort of a common understanding that this can actually be done, a feeling of empowerment that this can actually be done. For most of the time, people don't get into struggle because they don't think that it can be done, not because they don't want it. And I think it's our job to unleash that power that already exists. And when we talk about, when we use the word revolution, it really is a political revolution that we're talking about. Imagine if millions of people in this state, or if all the 700,000 people who live in Seattle were convinced, except for a few at the top who are not going to agree with us, of course, were convinced that we need to transform this economy, then what we would do is not amass weapons, but what we would do is march to City Hall and take it over through the power of people presence and say, we're going to run it our way. Or you take over Boeing, workers of Boeing take over Boeing and say, we're going to run it our way. The question of violence does not emerge in that sense. However, the question of violence does emerge in general. Why? Because that is one of the weapons the ruling class can use against us. And they, as we have seen, they don't actually hesitate to use it. They will unleash those weapons on us if they feel threatened enough, or sometimes if they make a miscalculation. And the reason I'm saying miscalculation is because it's not always in the interest of the capitalist class to unleash violence on us, because what happened with Occupy? Every time they did that, it enraged people and brought more people out on the streets. And that is inevitable. Ultimately, the question is, how many people are they going to attack? There's billions of us. They can't, that's not a weapon that they can actually use in any effective manner. And I'll give you another example, a very interesting example of the recent Egyptian revolution. 2 years ago, there was some violence unleashed by the military dictatorship there. But if you look at the scale of it, it was pretty minimal compared to what they could have done and what they wanted to do. There was well over 1 million young people on Tahrir Square. That is absolutely not what Mubarak's government liked. But they had no choice but to lump it. And the reason was that the rank and file of the military was clearly completely against unleashing any kind of violence on the people, because it was their own brothers and sisters. And that's something we have to remember. Every successful revolutionary movement has had this component to it where the working class that's out on the streets is able to win over the rank and file of the military apparatus, because they recognize that they are on, when they don the uniform, they're carrying out the agenda of the ruling class, but ultimately what they are is ordinary people. And there will be a point where they will refuse to carry out that agenda. So our real power in tackling that kind of violence is to actually politically inspire and mobilize people. So, I can talk more, but let's see if there are other questions. Of course, we really admire and value the efforts of all progressives. There's no question about that. So anybody who set up a free, public, high-quality educational institution, of course, that's an absolutely laudable thing. We really celebrate that fact. However, the problem is that if we were to rely on some wealthy person creating an institution that a few people can go to, it's one college, right? Yes, a lot of people have gone to that college, but if you look at statistically, what proportion of young people were able to go to a free school because of Cooper? A very, very small proportion. So it was free to all, but not everybody in the US can go to that college. So, I know, but physically, how many students is it going to hold?
Very small enrollment.
Exactly, very small enrollment. So, if you're thinking seriously about how to solve the problem of the lack of access to quality education to tens of millions of young people, how are you going to solve that problem if you rely on one or two rich elite and their good hearts? Yes, I welcome any rich person who wants to do that kind of good effort, but at the end of the day, that is not going to be the answer to our problem. And in reality, every person who makes enormous wealth has already carried out, whether they want to or not, whether consciously or not, carried out enormous global damage in order to earn that kind of wealth, because it does not come from a vacuum. If somebody made billions of dollars, that came at the cost of some millions of people getting impoverished and being denied their basic rights. So while I will admire efforts, I will be honest with you, I am not going to celebrate some billionaire making billions and then setting up a free school. Our real approach should be, how can we fundamentally transform society so that public, free, and high-quality education is available to all kids? Why only some kids who are able to go to that institution. Yes, it is open to all, but only a few people can go. As Joanne said, it's limited enrollment. So if we are interested in solving these larger problems, then it does require us to think about this system in a more fundamental way. There are some countries which have elements of what we would espouse, you know. So in fact, even the Soviet Union itself, let's start there because that's the most well-known example. For all the deep malaise that existed in that economy, in that society, the reality is that because it was, because it began from the basis of public ownership and using public resources to solve public problems, with all its faults, with all its deep corruption and oppression in many ways, because the vast majority of the public resources were pooled, were used collectively, the economy was able to deliver, contrary to many of the myths you've all heard, it was able to deliver housing, employment, women's rights to a great degree, food and clothing to the vast majority of people. After 500 years, to date, capitalism has not been able to do for the majority of the people in the world. In fact, the majority of the people in the world are severely lacking most of these resources, if not all. And so I would say that in terms of what economies existed or exist that are similar to what we're talking about, they have elements. So public ownership of resources is an absolute essential. I mean, it's not something that we think is nice or moral. Yes, that's true, but it's a necessary thing. Without publicly bringing together resources collectively and using them to solve the enormous problems of starvation and lack of healthcare and so on, this is not going to be possible. We cannot do this in a vacuum. We cannot solve the problem of starvation when Bill Gates owns $56 billion, because how will we solve the problem? Where will the food come from? Where will the resources come from? So in that sense, that's absolutely critical. What was missing in the Soviet Union was a democratic decision-making and a democratic ownership. So we would absolutely oppose any kind of bureaucratic control over how these resources are distributed. That not only makes it completely unfair and makes the system rotten from inside, but it also makes it grossly inefficient. So that was one of the problems with the later years of the Soviet Union. It became a very, very, from an economic standpoint, it became an inefficient system. If you look at Cuba, it has certain elements of what we would talk about. Again, Cuba has been able to do something that, Cuba is this tiny and very resource-poor country right next to this giant, this economic giant, which is rich in all kinds of resources and awash in wealth. And yet Cuba is able to deliver food and healthcare and education to its people, something that the US is not able to do, and it is directly related to how resources are, put into use. But at the same time, we wouldn't advocate for a Cuba, and for various reasons, Cuba has turned out the way it has turned out. When we say we are fighting for democratic socialism, we are not only talking about a publicly organized economy, but we are also talking about political and social freedoms. And in reality, some of the problems that you might hear about Cuba are also the outcome of the fact that a small country cannot really survive on it by itself, because if you want to deliver a really good standard of living today, today look at the level of technology, right? We are so far ahead compared to when 1917 happened. We have so much wealth, so much technology, just unimaginable innovations. The human race, human society today is completely capable of delivering a very, very high standard of living to everybody. We don't have enough money for everybody to have a high standard of living and for some people to be billionaires. No, that can't be possible. Everybody can have a high standard of living if we are able to take those resources into democratic ownership. But the point is that if we want to actually do that, we cannot do that in a small island. Cuba alone cannot satisfy the needs of all its people without actually being able to have economic relationships with other countries. And for that to actually work, again, it comes back to an international question. For that to actually work in a manner that works for people, it has to be a socialist economy globally where resources are being exchanged on the basis of what is good for society, not how can this, trading relationship give me another several $billion. That has to be the basis of it. If you look at several countries in Western Europe, again, as I said, they had several programs in place which we would advocate as part of a socialist economy. So full funding for public education, full funding for healthcare, guaranteed, nutritious and organic food. All those things would be part of a socialist economy. But we wouldn't say Sweden is exactly like what we would call it, because ultimately, first of all, the wealth that is, again, here comes the global perspective, the wealth that allows the government of Sweden to deliver this high standard of living to whatever extent it's able to is on the backs of other people in Africa and so on. So, globally, if you want to really talk about, Sweden as socialist, you can't really do that, because how is that possible? Somebody is being exploited. You have to, if you want to talk about socialism, you have to talk about the end of exploitation. It cannot be a socialist economy and have some people being exploited. That's an oxymoron. That's not a possibility. And so in that sense, they are very incomplete, and also for all the other reasons I've already stated, that those programs are under attack because those countries are still capitalist. One last example I'll give you is Finland. A lot of people will talk about Finland. It's an excellent example to understand some of the lessons, not because it's socialist, it's not socialist, but it has, if you look at the, school outcomes, like educational outcomes, they are just like, just absolutely in another scale compared to the countries like the United States. And the underlying reason why they do so well in so many things is because they have an unusually low level of economic inequality. They have very strong teacher unions, and teachers are paid really well. And I think those are indications of what we need in a future socialist economy. We do need, the need for labor unions will not go away. In fact, labor unions will be much more empowered in making sure that workers' rights are delivered consistently and without any breaks. But the fact that the Finnish economy has very low inequality and it's tied to a much higher standard of living than most other places is an indication for us why we are advocating for a socialist economy. That is exactly the root of the problem. The deep inequality that capitalism engenders is the problem, is the reason why we are seeing all this enormous rottenness in our society. And so from that standpoint, it does give us the way forward, that we do have to go towards an equal economy. And in closing, I would say that if people ask you about where has this worked, don't lose heart if there isn't an example today. Look, if there was an example today, we would be saying, let's do that, and rallying the working class to do that, and the capitalist class would be shaking in their boots. But whenever people say that and make you feel disheartened that, oh, there isn't an example today, you should say that everything that happened had to happen for the first time. When the abolitionists were advocating to end slavery, there were any number of well-meaning people who said, oh, it can't be done, slavery is here to stay, let's just fight for a kinder, gentler slavery, and I can't think of a more bizarre thing than a kinder slavery. If people had accepted that, that change would never happen. Women would never have had the right to vote. When women were fighting for the right to vote, that's what people were saying. No, such a thing can't happen. It's nowhere. And by the way, I can't leave without telling you that the first country where women got the right to vote was the worker state in Russia. Homosexuality was decriminalized for the first time there. And so it shows you what people are capable of doing if they actually have the decision-making power in their hands. When we have the power to actually do something, then there is no question that we will put a humane society in place because it's in our interests. It's as simple as that. There's nothing more, there's no other miracle behind it.